Build Your Own Internet, version 4. I hope you guys all got a program, but I'll give a quick layout of what's going on today. So, in the beginning, we'll do a little intro about the space, show you where the bathrooms are, and give you an intro to the projects that are putting on this event. And then we're going to go into a panel discussion with some digital policy community network experts for about 45 minutes, including Q&A. And then we're going to open up the floor for more snacking, for all those exciting workshops back there. So I'm going to call up Jenny, who's going to introduce us to the space. I don't know where she is. Oh.
Hey everyone, welcome. Awesome to see so many new faces. I'm just doing the housekeeping essentially. You are in the Omni Commons, which is a collective of 11 different collectives, and the Commons, a space that you are all welcome to participate in the creation. And housekeeping-wise, there's carbonated water and ginger ale and coffee over there on the tall table, and an assortment of awesome snacks and foodstuffs that Scott prepared for y'all today. Bathrooms are to my left, up over here. There's also more bathrooms up in the mezzanine if needed. And seeing chairs, there's a wheelchair accessible bathroom in the entrance hall, like right on the other side of these stairs here. And your exits are increase volume? Sorry. Are back here, obviously, in this corner entrance here. And does anyone have any questions about the space in general? Yes? How does the internet work? We're going to get to that next. So, and there was one more thing I wanted to announce, which is that we're currently running a crowdfunding campaign to build out the commercial kitchen in the basement and bring it up to code so it can become the home-based kitchen of Food Not Bombs, which is one of the collectives here, and Fat Beats Produce, which does youth entrepreneurship programs and farmers markets and CSAs, and other local caterers who can't afford the standard commercial kitchen rates in Oakland. So if you go to omnicommons.org/donate, you can help contribute to that campaign, or at least share it, please. And you ready?
Yeah, the password is the percentage there.
For your
that's the chicken food. Sorry for the. Oh. Hello, everyone. I'm Jorrit, and welcome to Build Your Own Internet. First of all, I'd like to thank the space Omni Commons and also Pseudo-Room and Pseudo-Mesh for providing such a cool, open place to just share ideas, build stuff, and then organize events like this. It was like I became involved about maybe like a year and a half ago, and yeah, we're really trying to figure out how to make a difference. So one of the reasons why I'm here is because I sort of I read up a little bit about the history of the internet, and it was designed to be very distributed, right? Distributed and open, and everyone's equal. And if I look at the internet today, it's like, why is it that most messages go through the hands of this one company that's owned by one person, right? What happened, right? So rather than sort of coming up with all sorts of philosophical things, I figured, why not just build my own internet, right? To see how it works and figure out how to empower myself and learn about, yeah, sort of how it works and how to sort of detach myself from these people who now are sitting on all your personal photos, on all your personal messages, and you just have to trust them to take care of it and not look at it secretly. They probably do, but yeah. So one of the things I wanted to do is just introduce a little bit about how all the people work here in this space. This is just one of the many examples in the world that are basically saying, I'm fed up with this centralized internet, and we're just going to do it ourselves. So Oakland is not the only place where it happens. You can actually talk to a lot of people in the room, and they'll tell you that there's projects in Spain, in Germany, in South America, and they're all building their own internet. So what I'm just about to show is how the people are organized here, because I think first you have to organize people, and then you can build your own internet. It doesn't work the other way around, right? So I'll introduce that, and then we'll have a short, very short Q&A, and then we'll go over to the panel discussions. Yeah? So build your own internet, right? You can do it too. So you might recognize this building. It's the building you're in right now. If you don't recognize it, it might be an issue. So we're actually in here now, and there's this really cool hackerspace called Pseudo-Room, which is in the back here, which is over there. And yeah, that's where this project really started. And so the building is Omnicommons, a collective of collectives. It's not just a bunch of creative hackers. It's also community organizers, food not bombs, all sorts of different organizations that want to make a change. And then there's Pseudo-Room, which I told you about. Oh, they have a website too. You can actually go to it and see what it's about. And then sort of part of Pseudo-Room, there's a thing called Pseudo-Mesh, which is kind of a geeky way of saying we're interested in networking, how to make independent networks. There's a website there too, Pseudo-Mesh. I don't know whether you can read it. And then there's a couple of projects that Pseudo-Mesh is involved in. So one of which is People's Open Network. And this is actually a project that helps you to share your internet connections and also to build a local mesh network. So it's actually being deployed right now in Oakland. So it's pretty, like, it's starting up right now. And one of the reasons to have a meeting like this is not just to tell people that you can build your own internet and that you don't have to sign some kind of weird contract to do it, but you can also join an existing project like People's Open Network. I'll show you a picture about it later. There's also disaster radio. Oh, one of the things here is try to imagine an apartment building with 60 units in it. I live in one of those. And if I go on my wireless network thing, I see 60 different SSIDs. And then when I see those 60 different SSIDs, I see the 60 different bills that come in every day or every month, right? And that's kind of crazy because you can, using meshing technology, you can get the routers in your house to actually start talking to each other and share internet connections. So for an entire apartment building, you don't have to have 60 bills. You can get like 3 really fast connections, and then get all these smart little machines out there that allow you to share that throughout the apartment complex. So there's a demo of it. It's called Cow and Chicken, and there are some signs across the room to sort of learn more about that. So that's People's Open Network. Disaster radio is really when trying to address the idea of what happens if the earthquake really happens and there's no more power, there's no more cell phones, and there's nothing left. How do you still communicate with each other? So they're really prototyping some really smart devices that allow you to do exactly that. And there's a table for it over there. So if you're interested in that, you can talk about that. And there's also build your own internet, which I think is a thing by itself. It's sort of an idea of, okay, let's share what we've learned so far and let people know that it's not some kind of magical thing. You can just do it yourself. And also, if you go to this website, you'll also see a big list of all the other projects around the world that do very similar things. So it's a way to say, go ahead and do it. Other people are, you can start your own or you can join an existing one. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. So now there's the obligatory dog picture, right? So here's a dog. This is really what it looks like when you're trying to build your own internet. You climb on the roof. You get one of these beamers that sort of shoots the Wi-Fi signal across very far if you need to. There's an example of it over there, and they're having a lot of fun doing it. So if you'd like to learn more about this, just mingle, talk to people here. There's tons of flyers out there, and that's it. Again, welcome. I'm glad you guys are here, and I hope you'll share what you know and learn a few things on the way, maybe also. Yeah. Any quick questions that come up? Yeah.
What's the current legal status of sharing connection with distraction partnership? Is that legal for me to sort of rebroadcast my ISP connection to my neighbors?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, what's the legal status of me opening up my internet connection? There's a trick that we use, which is very similar to VPN, which makes it very hard for your ISP to see how you use your internet. So, yeah.
And is it also legal?
I'm not a legal expert, so I'm not going to say anything about that.
Yeah, it's fully legal to share your internet in the U.S. You are not liable for other people's traffic. The reason why we do the VPN trick is not for legal reasons. It's not because it's illegal. It is for legal reasons. It's because even if it's legal, you could still get sued and you could still get angry letters. So it's fully legal to share, but your contract with your internet service provider may or may not allow you to do so. So some ISPs allow you to share, most don't. Sonic, DSL, for example, you're allowed to share. There's a couple of local providers, and actually the EFF has a site called, I think, Open Wireless or something like that lists all the ones allowed to share in the area.
See, so this is how I learn new things every day also. I was just sort of ignoring the issue, I guess. Yeah. So one more question. What's EFF? EFF is the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I sort of see it as the ACLU of the internet. But I'm sure that's... Sorry? Yeah, maybe it'll come up during the panel discussion, I think. So thanks a lot for listening, and again, I hope you have a great time and talk to each other, because that's really what the internet's about, right? It's not about people or computers talking to each other, it's about people talking to each other. All right, thanks a lot.
Great. Can I have my panelists come up here? Hi. So here we are in Oakland, on the edge, or arguably in Silicon Valley, which Silicon Valley, according to CityLab, gets 40% of all venture capital investments. That's about $13 billion worth of money that goes into building new startups, tools, apps to help people walk their dogs, to renting out their cars, all kinds of things to incentivize the building of all kinds of new technology. And over the last few decades, a lot of these technologies have helped us communicate with each other. There's obviously YouTube, there's all kinds of platforms that has revolutionized how we talk to each other, how we share and participate in culture, and it's collapsed barriers of time and space. And yet, Oakland, where we are right now, which has been transformed by the tech economy, if you've been paying any attention, 30% of Oakland residents do not have access to the internet at home or at work or elsewhere. Half of young people here have no home access, and I would definitely say that that's mostly lower income and people of color. And meanwhile, that's an access issue, but meanwhile the internet itself is getting torn apart. Well, arguably it was sort of doomed from the beginning, but people are increasingly equating the internet not with, a healthy ecosystem of websites where somebody can just put up a website on a browser and create a new e-commerce site or a page where they have their art or their blog. It's more and more siloed into Facebook and Google and all of these very siloed web pages that are collecting all of your data to sell you things, to show you ads, and surveilling you. And of course, now we know surveilling you and giving all that information to the NSA, to ICE, to all of these federal agencies. Who knows what they're going to use it for or what they've been using it for. To contextualize Oakland too, according to the FCC, 51% of Americans only have one choice of ISP. So when you think about what happened this past year, does anyone know about net neutrality or heard the word net neutrality? Raise your hand. Cool, great. So the net neutrality fight wasn't something that just happened over the last year. It was a long fight since 2010. And the question was, should the federal government have rules that regulate how ISPs allow you to connect to the internet, or how it deals with how you connect to the internet? So net neutrality is the idea that an ISP should not be able to block content, to throttle your data, or to have paid prioritization of certain services like you see with cable services. In 2015, under the last administration, after a long fight and over 3.5 million people sent in comments to the FCC, they finally voted to enact these protections at the federal level. Of course, this past year we have a new president, and he appointed somebody that was once a Verizon lawyer, Ajit Pai, and his mission was to unravel those rules. And despite popular resistance, millions of people again sending in comments, going to the streets, showing up at Verizon, putting up signs, they voted about a month ago to repeal those net neutrality protections. So where are we now? We have this internet that is not really distributed. It's distributed amongst some ISPs that control, how we connect to each other. After that net neutrality fight, there were a lot of renewed discussions about what the internet is really about. What is the internet? And from that, a lot of people were talking about community networks. And community networks, which I'll ask the panelists what their definitions are, is the general idea that people controlling the internet. And there's a lot of ways that looks. but that's what we're here to talk about, is what would an internet look like if we actually controlled it. So I'm going to have everybody do quick introductions. I'll start with myself, and then we'll dive into questions. So my name is Mai Ishikawa Sutton, and I'm a community organizer and writer, really interested in digital equity and how we can all be better connected to the internet and, of course, to each other so that we can talk about the actual problems in our lives that affect each other. I was also an activist for almost 5 years fighting the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement around how those copyright rules can make it harder for students and artists and everybody to access culture and knowledge online. So that's my background, and I will pass it on.
Hey y'all, my name is Preston Ray. I am a passionate activist for democracy over infrastructure for about a decade now. I currently work at the ISP Monkey Brains in San Francisco. There was some Monkey Brains equipment in that photograph on top of Noise Bridge, actually. And I'm also on the board of a nonprofit in the Bay Area called Community Technology Network that does digital literacy training and sets up public computer centers for people of all stripes to learn to make use of their technology. I also used to, before I moved to San Francisco, work at the Open Technology Institute in Washington, D.C., where, among other things, I was on the field team for implementing a mesh project called Commotion, and I also organized some of my own mesh networks in D.C. and helped organize some others elsewhere.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tracy Rosenberg. I work with Oakland Privacy, which is centered here at the Omni, and I'm the director of Media Alliance, which is a nonprofit that advocates for democratic communications and social justice, shall we say, social justice and grassroots-oriented use of the media infrastructure around us. Yes, I was confused about the protocol. It's like right here in the juncture.
Hi, everybody. My name's Shahid Buttar. I'm a lawyer, writer, organizer, and musician. I work at the Electronic Frontier Foundation as the director of grassroots advocacy, and I'm also on the board of the Center for Media Justice, which is based here in Oakland.
I got my own. Right on. Okay. Hi, I'm Tim Kozar. I've been working on democratic communications since the 70s, where I started community radio stations, did bulletin board systems in the 80s, deploying them in places like the Soviet Union, South Africa, where they did not have democratic communications. In the 1990s, I started one of the world's first ISPs called Little Garden. And recently I'm deploying, in the last 10 years, I've been managing a fiber network called a community broadband network that hooks up all the housing networks, housing deployments in the city of San Francisco, and run that.
Great. Thanks, everybody. So I'm going to direct this at Shahid first, and if anybody wants to chime in, go ahead. So Shahid, can you break down why big telecom companies like AT&T, Comcast, Verizon are against net neutrality?
Has anyone here heard a story about corporations abusing the rights of people? It's that story yet again. Corporate ISPs enjoy a very attractive landscape that usually is dominated by local monopolies, and when you're in a monopolistic position vis-a-vis the people who purchase your services, you can essentially extract economic rent from them. And rent-seeking behavior is essentially what the corporate ISPs are engaged in, and it goes one step beyond that, because it's not only rent-seeking from the people who purchase their services, but they also operate in a way to basically change the rules to allow themselves, in the face of prior established public policy decisions to preserve an open internet. The corporate ISPs have been essentially attacking the legal framework that gives you the right, and tomorrow's innovators the right, to access the global network on the same terms as everyone else. So you might think of it as economic self-protection. You might think of it as corporate control over our social choices. You might think of it as economic rent-seeking behavior. You might think of it as capital invading the policy sphere to construct social rules that favor itself. Any of those things would be fairly descriptive of the reality.
Yeah. Thank you. Great. And I'll direct the next one at Tracy. What are the potential impacts of the FCC's repeal of net neutrality protections?
Yeah. The impacts are sort of fairly broad. The more sort of, obvious past examples of net neutrality violations are pretty straightforward. Blocking and throttling, slowing down of signals. That kind of behavior, as the ISPs have really already told us, gets such an angry response from the recipients that it's questionable whether the egregious application of that is really going to happen. Because in order for these changes, for this attack on the internet to set, they sort of have to at least give some lip service to the idea that they are in fact not blocking and throttling the internet. When it comes to paid prioritization, though, you get into a much more subtle and much more difficult to detect set of possibilities, because the multiple things that can be prioritized over other things and the difficulty of identifying what is happening when, because, blocking's pretty easy to see. Something's blocked. It didn't get from point A to point B. Why? But what went in front of what and why it did and who paid who for what, and the role that reasonable or unreasonable network management plays in these kinds of things is much subtle and much harder to detect. So what we're probably going to see is various forms of paid prioritization that will not be called paid prioritization. They'll be called something else. Happening sort of at fairly subtle levels and then increasingly growing more and more blatant and more obvious to the people that are on the wrong side of those sudden fast lanes that will open up here and there. And I think for most of us, it's pretty clear that we're on the front lines of what they're going to call a slow lane. I mean, we are the people. We are never the ones that will be prioritized. So in whatever capacity we use the internet as activists, as artists, as entrepreneurs, as small business people, as bloggers, as artists, we will find that the impacts will come to us, and they'll come to us fairly soon. First in kind of annoying but not crucial ways, and then in ways that start to become really fatal to the work that we're trying to do. Mortal and fatal and important.
Anyone have someone else? Yeah, you can.
I would just add that I certainly agree with all that. I do think that there is a more real risk of blocking and throttling than we might be acknowledging. For instance, just to name names, AT&T several years ago blocked its customers from being able to access Apple's FaceTime app. And there's no reason to think that ISPs, whether it's Comcast or AT&T or Verizon, will make different choices going forward, particularly when they have conglomerate business activities that might create incentives to basically favor their own subsidiaries or other corporations with which they have business development deals over others. And I certainly agree that paid prioritization is problematic, particularly because it inhibits future innovation. It has the tendency to freeze the internet as we know it, to favor existing corporate behemoths, and to disadvantage potential entrants that would disrupt those business models. And remember, these are business models that themselves were based on disruption, premised on equal access to the network. I think while paid prioritization is still obviously a problem, we should not take our eye off the ball of the more frontally offensive, predictable, recurring, and established historical violations like blocking and throttling, which go straight at the core premise of the internet, inhibiting users from being able to access certain voices and inhibiting certain voices from being able to access readers and users.
Great. Thank you. I feel like we have sort of diagnosed much of the problems of the internet. Maybe let's switch to talking about the actual potential solutions. So I want to bring in Tim and then Preston and then go around to answer this question. So what does a community network mean to you, and what are the required characteristics of a community network?
You want me to go first? Yeah. Okay. A community network is basically, by the definition of the name, is a network that's run by the community. We have to keep in mind that there's, when we're talking about the internet, people tend to conflate multiple parts of the internet and use the internet as a all-encompassing term for it. I heard you mention people who are managing your content and drilling into your privacy through that, Facebook, various other people. That is the content side of things. That's not necessarily what we're trying to address right here in this talk, I think. What we're trying to talk about is, and she's talked about a little bit earlier, network neutrality. 95% of the problems with network neutrality are basically tied up in the last mile. And the fact that the last mile, you have no choice. In many areas in the country, you have zero choice. 50% of the country, as she was describing, has only one choice. And maybe if you're lucky, you have two choices. And those are the incumbents that were there artificially because you had the telephone. Keep in mind that the internet now is considered anything that you have to have broadband. Once upon a time, the internet was you dial up and you dial into CompuServe or AOL or something like that. You had multiple internet service providers you could connect to. You had true competition at that point. At this point in time, with broadband, you only have really the cable company or the telephone company in many areas of the world, or at least the United States. So, and keep in mind, those got there because they had an agreement with the United States to be the incumbent telephone provider, and that was guaranteed profit and such, and that meant that they can go out and put out a huge infrastructure and be able to guarantee profit on that in trade for making sure that the rural farm resident had the same cost as the city resident to be able to get telephone access. And that was the trade. In the same case with the cable company made a deal with the municipality to said, we're not going to have competition, but yet we'll provide cable service throughout this community, and usually there's some kickback to the municipality for like open access or free access to content in schools and such. So these are two artificially created companies. You have no other competition. We call this a duopoly. And because of that, these people these companies can put the screws down and be able to say, you know what, we're going to charge a lot for internet access because we have to pay these ESPN fees and various other fees. And by the way, we're also looking for alternative revenues for this. So one way would be to charge you a little bit more to go to a competitor like Netflix, if you're a Comcast, or to charge Netflix a little bit more to deliver their content to you on Comcast. And believe it or not, they're charging on both ends, and they have been for a while. Look at paid peering as an example, as one of those things. So a community network would be something that would bypass that last mile. My interpretation of a community network would be one that doesn't actually supply internet, but it just supplies a backhaul between a resident or a community that wants to use this service back to some place where you can actually have competition. So my definition, which I proposed to the city of San Francisco in 2007, was one which basically is just a pipe that goes between a street address and a data center where you can get a big menu of other providers. So you can, and this addresses network neutrality in the fact that, excuse me if I'm going too long on this, in that if you don't like that one particular network ISP because they're doing some sort of silly throttling or something like that, you call up another ISP, they type a couple keyboard strokes, and voila, you're on some other provider like Monkey Brains or Sonic or somebody else. And by addressing the last mile, you've just, again, addressed 95% of the problems with network neutrality. There's still another 5% that needs to get addressed, probably through regulatory. But anyway, that's my definition of community network.
My definition of community networks. I just want to expand a bit on what Tim said by and I want to start with first principles too. So we live under capitalism, which is a system where capital accumulates, and those of us who do not have access or controlling access to large amounts of it have to trade our labor in order to survive with some of that capital. And also, we live in a class society where there are different classes that have different amounts of power. The capitalist class, the ruling class, has basically all the power that they control our ability to trade our labor or whatever to live. So, how many of you have heard of the term the digital divide? Raise your hand if you've heard of this term, the digital divide. So I posit to you that the digital divide is really a description for the extension of class society onto what we consider the internet. Because there are some people who have it, and there are some people who don't have it. And even further layering down to show the awesome power of capital and class society, for those who have broadband, we used to have net neutrality guaranteed in this country, so there really was as long as you were in that class that has internet, then you're good to go, just like everybody else, equal access, what have you. Now, the class society has even further integrated a layer into the internet where we are going to start seeing, as Tim pointed out, preferred services, payment for those who, again, have the money, have the capital to do that. So the name of this panel is Build Your Own Internet, and I also want to get us all together on a quick first principle here. Do we all agree that the reason that we want to build our own internet, the reason we're attracted to this panel and this discussion and this participation in the first place, is because we believe that building our own internet in some way is a liberatory project? Okay, so to expand further on Tim's definition of what a community network is and what the point of it is that I think that a community network describes any sort of network, internet, switch network, what have you, and all its layers. That could even be a phone tree if you like, but it's something that is anti-capitalist in that its purpose is not to concentrate capital in some way for its owners or managers. And that its purpose is, as Tim pointed out, to serve the needs of the community. So that's actually really messy and kind of an excellently messy thing in that you don't have I'm the community network and you're the ISP, and it's like this sort of clean square versus circle. It's not quite that at all. A community network really is probably managed really roughly and in many different ways, and probably imperfectly, beautifully imperfectly, hopefully, as a collection of some people with a lot of resources who are happy to donate those resources of bandwidth or of the top floor of their office tower or of their handy person experience or of their networking experience. And it's also probably managed over here by a few different institutions or organizations like the Omni Commons and Pseudo Room. And it's probably managed over here in some way by kids in an after-school program who are learning how to build and maintain the network and learning how to build applications for that network. You draw a circle around these things, and as long as that network is being in some way serving the needs of the community that is kind of determining together what its principles and its desires for that network are, congratulations, you have a community network that is anti-capitalist and that will ultimately bring about a liberatory project for the community that it's in. And to that point, I also want to make sure that we're focusing on we're probably going to talk a lot about means of transmission, fiber, radio, packet shaping. Are you going to use Batman? Are you going to use OLSRD? All this stuff that frankly does not matter at all because it's all completely solved. The challenge is a social challenge, and the social challenge is a challenge of shared infrastructure, democracy. So really, the point is not. I want us to think about the point is not I'm going to build my own internet and hooray, I'm going to be liberated. The problem is, as Mai pointed out, 50% of young people in Oakland don't have access to the internet. And what is the problem that they don't have access to the internet, or is the problem that because they don't have access to the internet, they lack the ability to easily do their homework in a safe way, get better opportunities, for jobs, have good access to health care, are going to be gentrified out of their homes very quickly after another massive corporation buys a building downtown, sits on it for 2 years, and then sells it at $100 million profit. These are the problems. So how do you solve those problems? By building your own internet. This is what the purpose of designing a community network is. It has to emerge from a place like the Omni Commons and then it will serve the community that the OmniCommons serves. It's not the other way around. It's just like build it and they will come. Sorry that took a while.
No, that was great. Do you guys have something to add?
Yeah, so again, I don't want to disagree with anything, and I love the framing, particularly of community broadband as anything that is liberatory, and I'll definitely buy that. I guess I would push back on the framing of it as necessarily anti-capitalist, because there are some models of community broadband that can be very compatible with capitalist norms of distribution. I'm thinking particularly of, I think it's Amen, Idaho, is a community where the city council essentially invested $20,000 to build a fiber optic network as an alternative to paying a corporate ISP $80,000 to build the same loop, and then the city makes that network available to small ISPs, which can then lease that bandwidth and then resell it to the community, which is just to say that even if you're a capitalist, community broadband can be consistent with your aims. It's still liberatory, and I think that there's a continuum of DIY-ness. You know, you can have mesh networks or other kinds of networks that are strictly run by people in their individual capacities. You can have municipal or local networks that involve basically leveraging the governance system to pool resources in the way that we all do anyway through the tax system to then use those funds in a way that helps and serves the community. You know, you might hope that the latter is itself driven by community interests, and if we lived in a very robust democracy, that would be true. But to your point, I think you know, those aspirations sometimes are more aspirations than reflections on current reality. But absolutely, community broadband is liberatory, and I want to particularly reinforce the point that the challenge is a social and political one, that the technological constraints are ones that are solvable. Ultimately, is the political will of communities to invest resources in shared public goods, or the willingness of individuals and communities to provide those tools and infrastructure for each other, even in the absence of that political will.
Tracy, do you have something to add?
No, I'm okay. It's all been said. Next question.
Yeah. So the Institute for Local Self-Reliance is an organization that works on local economic development. And so they do things like fighting for laws to enable people to create their own composting networks locally, to also fighting for community broadband networks. And they just released a map this week that showed that there's over 750 community broadband networks. And it's a sort of a broad term, which includes municipal broadband. So if you think about the internet as like a public utility in the same way that you would pay for water, and that would be highly regulated so that they can't gouge you in the same way that your ISP does. Or it's run by a electric cooperative or a cooperative, and so it's democratically governed within the enterprise. A cooperative is an enterprise that is democratic, so the workers or the members who use the service, who build the service, own and control it. And so that's another way in which internet can be much more publicly oriented instead of to their shareholders. And so my next question is, what is an example, if you all have one, some have already been named, but a example of a successful community network that's out there in the world?
I run one. We have, as I mentioned earlier, we have a 1 gig and 10 gig fiber network that lights up most of the housing developments around San Francisco. Actually, Monkey Brains is actually starting to get into this as well a little bit. But this one is completely owned by Department of Technology in the city of San Francisco. From that, we actually have extended it out into the neighbors from each housing development by putting up wireless, and so people across the street can connect to these things. We've extended it out to even the Farallon Islands. I don't know if you know about them, but there are some islands about 50 kilometers due west of San Francisco, and they get a 200 megabit feed from that we donated to them through auspices of California Academy of Sciences and various other people to be able to get scientists out there to be able to have access, as well as, again, the housing development in the neighborhoods around it and such.
Yeah. we were sort of touching on the difference between sort of community and municipal broadband a little bit in the last conversation, so I'll kind of start there. If you're talking about a municipal or a city network, there's no better example than Chattanooga, Tennessee, of all places, where the city set up an ISP competitor that was cheaper and faster than anything provided by a telecom in town. The whole city ate it up. AT&T got so mad they went to the capital of Tennessee and bought the appropriate legislators, golf tournaments, and so on, and were able to pass a law that the Chattanooga municipal system could not extend beyond the city limits of Chattanooga, even though there were people living 5 minutes from the border saying, please, God, let us participate in this system. And they were basically told that they couldn't. It's an interesting sort of, what's the word, counterpoint to the current net neutrality argument going on that the Obama-level FCC sort of told the state of Tennessee, leave Chattanooga, stop that and let the municipal broadband plan extend because it needs to. Basically, they preempted state law, and they were taken to court and they lost. So the idea that the FCC can jump in and preempt, say, a California net neutrality law may not be quite as etched in the sand as some people think that it is, because the last time the FCC tried to preempt a state law, they went down in flames. So there's Chattanooga on the community side. On the sort of co-op side, there's some interesting stuff going on in the city of Detroit. I think that Red Hook Brooklyn is still up and running. That's an OTI project from way back when.
More of those, both of those things.
Yeah, so there are plenty of real-life examples that are out there, and there are mesh networks probably of some size or the other in about 12 or 13 different cities that I can think of.
Around the world, there must be dozens and dozens.
Yeah.
And dozens.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, President.
I'd like to jump a couple of things. Pluck my heartstrings personally there. For one thing, Chattanooga is on the north end of Lookout Mountain, and the south end of Lookout Mountain is a town called Gadsden, Alabama, which was recently in the news that's where Roy Moore is from. I'm from Gadsden, Alabama as well, and it's just such a shame that on one end of the mountain they have municipal broadband and like a booming economy, and on the other end, well, here I am in the Bay Area. So, sorry, I can't shame the hometown too much. But the other thing is you mentioned Detroit and Red Hook. I worked on a program that was funded by the Stimulus Act. Remember the Stimulus Act? There was a portion of the Stimulus Act called the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program, or BTOP, that funded a number of really excellent initiatives around the country, and some of that effort, whether directly funded through BTOP or not, wound up through the Commotion Project in developing a program or curriculum called the Digital Stewards Curriculum that was developed in Detroit as part of the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition. And I was an instructor on the first round of Digital Stewards instruction in Detroit. We also ported the model to Red Hook Brooklyn, which is kind of governed by the Red Hook Initiative, a community services nonprofit there. Currently, the people who we instructed as the first class of digital stewards in 2013, that movement has evolved into now forming the core of 3 separate nascent and kind of beginning to be successful community ISPs in Detroit. It's currently under the name the Equitable Internet Initiative. There's an excellent video that anyone who wants to build their own internet, I recommend you watch this 13-minute video. It's on Vice Motherboard from a few months ago of some of those folks who are working there. Red Hook Digital Stewards, also still going, the Red Hook Wi-Fi Initiative out of the public housing there in Red Hook. That initiative began in earnest after Hurricane Sandy knocked out so much of the power and so much access to Red Hook, and the youth in the public housing there learned to develop and build a resilient mesh network that continues to expand and serve the community there in Red Hook. Also, if anyone's able to find online the resources from the last International Summit for Community Wireless Networks, which happened in 2013 in Berlin, Germany, there were a number of really excellent community network and research network projects that were represented there from around the world. Athens, Catalonia, there's some community fiber in the north of England. There's a whole bunch of networks in like Thailand. There's just a lot of really excellent resources out there. So like there are a lot that function.
No? Okay. So unfortunately, we have to start wrapping this part up and open the floor for questions. But before we do that, I wanted to do one more round and talk about whether you're pessimistic or optimistic about the future of an equitable, open internet that may close the digital divide, and what would it take to do that? I heard from several of the panelists that it is, not the technology. You'll be able to go back there and crimp cables and see, all this awesome technology, and of course, all of this is open source, and we're trying to make it easier and much easier for anybody to actually build their own internet to in the future get a box, and then you can just knock on your door's neighbor and put a few routers in there and have your own local internet, maybe have like a shared calendar or wiki, to create those nodes, these local, hyper-local internet to connect you with your neighbors and friends. But we don't have that now. So what sort of stands in the way between where we are now and that sort of vision for these many internets?
So just to offer a couple lenses on that, the next round in the net neutrality fight, separate from communities reclaiming control of their own internets, at the federal level at least, relates to the congressional opportunity to overturn the FCC by an act pursuant to the Congressional Review Act. It will take the finalization of the FCC's rule to trigger a 60-day window after the rule is published in the Federal Register, during which Congress will be able to act. I'm very enthused to see this many of you here, and particularly when Mai asked the question, who here understands the principles behind network neutrality, every hand went up, and Tracy and I had a little exchange that a year ago I don't think that would have been true here or anywhere else. But I do think the controversy surrounding the FCC's attack on an open internet has alarmed so many different people from so many different corners, not just here in the Bay Area, but even in parts of the country that are much more politically conservative, are concerned about denials of equal access, about the co-optation of an infrastructure that was promised to be liberatory and increasingly is becoming co-opted, let's say, by conglomerations of capital. Even in places that have no consensus to challenge capitalism, there is a political consensus favoring an open internet. And I do think that Congress risks its own institutional legitimacy, and members risk their own seats if they don't show up to defend the open internet here. And then a last piece I'll just throw out here, a little bit self-serving, a plug for my project at EFF, which relates to this. The Electronic Frontier Alliance is a network of local autonomous community groups that we founded at EFF. There are now over 70 of them in over 25 states. These are communities of people like high school students in Clarksville, Tennessee, not far from Chattanooga, or one of the latest is a network of students at UC Merced in the Central Valley here in California, who are coming together to teach each other, much as you all are doing here today, about how to realize liberation through technology. And I think that's a really profound praxis, and I think the idea of building community around that exploration offers immense promise, both for the struggle for an open internet and any number of other values.
Well, to leverage what you were just talking about, there's a couple things here. Network neutrality is certainly a concern. Again, most of that can get eradicated if we can provide competition at the last mile, and that's part in hand why we're here, and to talk about how the technology can leapfrog these last mile providers, these incumbents. The technology is actually easy, it's provable. Where you get into problems is the financial and the political layers of the network stack. And we've alluded to that to some degree. Hopefully the FCC will figure out, and we can help them and push them towards the direction of being able to put enough safeguards in there to be able to ensure that we have equal footing for people who want to connect and people who want to provide content on the internet to make this a truly democratic form of communications. I think that even if that doesn't happen, we'll probably figure out a way to get around that. The people who won't be able to are the people in rural America, where it's much more difficult to get that last mile connection. I'm really concerned about those folks. We live in an area that we have enough resources to be able to leapfrog this. And we're seeing that by other companies, again, like Monkey Brains, like Sonic and things like that. And even the People's Network here that is trying to do that kind of thing. But a lot of places in the middle of Wisconsin don't have those resources. We've got to figure that out for them.
Yeah, I'll kind of jump off your last point, which is, you're optimistic and pessimistic. I think about different aspects of this whole thing that we're talking about. I am optimistic that some areas like Oakland will be able to develop kick-ass community networks. I'm less optimistic that some other areas will be able to garner the resources and the knowledge and the sort of community cohesiveness to kind of do that. And like anything, when you've got a patchwork, you get another version of the digital divide based on sort of where you live and what kind of a community you inhabit. And unless there's some sort of massive commitment, I think, of resources and talent and expertise to the idea of an alternative network, it's always going to be a little patchy, a little up and down and kind of here and there. In terms of an anti-corporate internet, which I think is a different thing, because as Preston kind of laid out, there's the sort of anti-capitalist internet that is really a community organizing vehicle. And then there's things like community broadband, which are, I don't know, is Obamacare the right metaphor? It kind of might be. It gets you out of the worst abuses of a strictly corporate internet, but without that sort of community organizing people's ownership model. Because the city may be well-intentioned, but it's not you. It's not the community. And so the power is sort of residing with a local government entity, which we hope and pray and will pressure to try to do the right thing. And often they will, and sometimes they won't. In terms of the network neutrality stuff, which is kind of, the worst egregious ends of the corporate internet and keeping hold of what we have now so it doesn't get worse, the Congressional Review Authority in D.C. is exciting. I don't know how to make Trump sign it, but I'm sure we all have a plan. There's also a lot of stuff going on in the states that I think is briefly worth talking about. There is legislation in a number of states, including California, where we have two bills that will essentially make net neutrality the operating policy of a state. And that's done by two ways. One is sort of a purchasing thing. The state will do no business with any company that doesn't practice net neutrality principles. And then there's the more sort of broad, well, it's just net neutrality is the law in our state, and if you break it, we'll prosecute you approach. Whether or not those will stand up in court, nobody knows, but there are, I believe, 14 states that now have them in some phase of the process, including California. That's a lot of states at once pretty quick. The other thing is you have a couple of governors who have gotten somewhat impatient or maybe skeptical of their own process of their government and have just said to heck with that and have issued executive orders of the state, governors' executive orders like Obama signed DACA into law, just I, the governor, state that net neutrality is the state of the law in this state, period. The governor of Montana did that about a week ago, and Governor Cuomo in New York just followed. So that's two, and there will likely be more. Jerry Brown has not yet jumped into that ditch. And that's at least quick. I mean, instead of fighting for a year, it's like, bam, it's done. And I think that if enough of that snowballs, we'll at least see some kind of federal reaction and possibly some space for some states to kind of do at least some restraining of the worst of the corporate abuses. So yeah, optimistic about some things and pessimistic about others.
On the question of if I'm optimistic or pessimistic about the internet, I'm actually quite pessimistic on the whole. But there is, I think the internet's dying. But there is one light at, like one possible way forward, and if there's hope, it lies in the proles. And to jump off of what Tim said about resources, like we can do this. It's possible for us to build something else that functions, that meets our needs, that is democratically governed, that's resilient, that can survive the onslaught of everything from natural disasters to abuse of capital monopoly. But in order to do that, in order to build that thing, we need resources. And the resources of simply like, we can do this on the weekends, I can answer my cell phone every couple of hours if you have a problem and maybe make an appointment to come see you 4 days from now. That is not the level of resources that will allow us to successfully build a resilient and functional internet. If we want to get serious about advancing ground for the people and use infrastructure to do that, you got to get serious with the resources that you need in order to do that. Money, time, expertise, dedication, whatever it takes. And volunteerism, while a wonderful start, can only be a gateway to what that is.
Great, thank you so much. And I think I just want to conclude with just sort of two takeaways, which is there's the internet, which you know as the one that you connect to get to Facebook or Google and all these services, big capital I internet, and thinking about how there's a possibility for there to be many internets. The potential for blocks, for Oakland to have its own local internet. There's all kinds of ways in which we can potentially connect to each other, but again, as many have said, that it is the social, the political, the financial aspect of that. And People's Open Network is a very grassroots. We're all volunteers here. This space was, we're part of the Omni project, as you know. So, this is all done as a sort of a labor of love. And so, we'd love to have your help. The second point is that exactly, which is if you go back there and see the map of nodes, we have nodes all across Oakland, but we have yet to make it as vibrant as we'd like, and we're a work in progress, and we're building towards that. So we'd really love to see more people participating, helping us build that organizing, to organize your neighbors, the people that you live close to actually build something that works, that you could actually use and connect to the people that you live nearby. So I know we're a little bit over, but I'd like to take maybe just 2 questions from the audience, and I think a few of us are at least I'm going to be here for the rest of the day, and so if you'd like to ask us questions after, please do. Do I see? Yeah. Sorry, is this a question?
Yeah, right. What are the 5 categories that you need to put in to get started?
What are the 5?
I think it's what are the 5 things that you most need to start or build out a community network? Which is a question for those 2.
Dodge, duck, dip, dive, dodge. No, I'm just kidding. I would say there's actually, other than like having resources, I would say there's 3 skills you need. You need someone who has like computer networking skills. This is an order of hierarchy, by the way, of importance. You need someone who has computer networking skills. You need someone who has like construction, handy person experience, can build things that will last and will not cause people's like houses to rot and leak in the rain. And then you need community organizing experience. Those are the 3 things you need. What are the things you need to get started? The categories of things you need to get started.
It was 5 things, so now there's 2 left.
An arbitrary number. Okay, I actually saw your hand. Can you yell your question?
Yeah, no problem. For people who don't care about these issues as much as everybody in this room does community internet, like the kinds that you're talking about, have been implemented in neighborhoods, is that an alternative that is attractive to them, that is easy for them to use, that can also perhaps grow and receive investment?
Yes. Just about in the past 3 months, 9,000 people that never talked to me about this before, even though they know that I work on that, said, oh my God, so now Comcast, AT&T are going to throttle my internet and charge me $1 million for the same services. What are we going to do? I need to get my internet somewhere else. How do I do that? So it's what I would kind of joke around is the fact that sort of they've pushed so hard and they've overreached so much that what used to be the fringe is moving to the center. In other words, the mainstream comes to you sometimes because of what happens politically. And at this point, how do I get my internet from anybody but them is a really mainstream, common, out there, understandable question. And I think pretty much everybody's asking it, and kind of what's the answer to it. They may not know the answer, but they sure know what the question is.
I know those 2 questions. I'm sorry. Okay, we'll take one more question in the front.
What is the last mile?
What is the last mile is the question.
Good question.
Actually, originally it was called the last mile. I've heard a lot of people call it the first mile just to try to switch the perception of the connection to the internet. In the original definition of the last mile, it's your connection. It's the one that you plug into at home to your provider. Now, what we try to do in community networks is to make that relatively short. So you shouldn't have to have your traffic go all the way back to Kansas City to be able to get to the internet. And it would be great if the last mile can be replaced again by the incumbent, replace the incumbent last mile. So community broadband networks or community networks like the one that we're talking about here are trying to address that connection.
Yeah, and if I could just add, when people talk about the enormous advantage of the incumbent, what they're talking about is really the last mile, because that's the expensive part of the network. The part that goes to your particular device to sort of the information server or the central point costs way more than any other part of the network. So the fact that the incumbents have rights of way, they have the cable infrastructure or they have the telephone infrastructure, has given them an enormous advantage because it's very difficult to replicate that last mile connection. That's the part that can't be replicated. And that's the sort of investment which they're constantly taking all this money for over and over again. So the last mile is really the economic impediment to community networks as much as anything else. Or to competition, really.
Take control of the last mile, build democracy over your infrastructure, down with the incumbents.
Great. Thank you so much for all the panelists and all of your great insight. Give them a hand. Cool. All right. So this event is not over. The fun part of mingling and eating more and looking at all these great tables is next. Grant is going to tell us about what's out there.
All right, thanks. That was fantastic. So yeah, don't leave yet. There's still lots of panels. You don't have to sit here and listen to me talk if you don't want to. Yeah, just like don't go. Yeah, so that was fantastic. Yeah, thank you to all the panelists and to Mai for hosting the panel and moderating. Fantastic job. So yeah, it's not over. So are y'all ready to build your own internet now? Yeah. All right. So now we're going to actually get to the fun part. That was just the icing on the cake here. This is the meat. So there's a handful of stations, quite a few actually, set up around if you saw the tables when you came in. Starting from the first one here, I'm going to go with is Garden Mesh. X, if you want to raise your hand. And so if you read the program, it has a description in there, so I'm not going to bother going over again, but it's meshing your plants, and you can go talk to them if you want to know about that. The next table is Incentivize Mesh with Jahan. If he is not at his table, that's all right. And So that's about routers that pay each other, so you can learn about that. The next one over is disaster radio, and I'll probably be there. It's a disaster relief and communications network, so you can learn about that. Next back is internet in a box. You can learn about the hardware that People's Open is actually using and putting on people's roofs. And then we have the make your own swag table, so if you want to get any buttons and stickers and color with some crayons and color pencils, you can check that out. The crimping station is right behind that, so learn how to crimp your own Ethernet cable. And in the back, we have the crypto bar, I guess it's now, the crypto bar. And so there'll be some people from the EFF and the Electronic Frontier Foundation there, and people knowledgeable about cryptography and security on the internet. And right next to that is community mapping. So if you're interested in connecting to the People's Open Network, you can go talk to them. Or if you want to just learn about what other mesh networks are there in the world, you can go. So you're free to go now. Break.